The father of our Constitution, James Madison, had an interesting take on the separation between church and state. As he wrote to Baptist church leaders in 1811, and he was president, he said, "I've always regarded the practical distinction between religion and civil government as essential to the purity of both." Madison knew that we shouldn't mix religion and government just to protect ourselves against the rise of the theocrats, and not just to do that, but also to preserve religion itself in its purest form, free from political meddling. Both entities, church and state, are better off when they're separated entirely from each other. Now, interestingly, the same maxim holds true when it comes to corporation and state. When mixed, both become corrupted, not just the government, both. Our founding fathers knew this all too well, as they had rebelled not just against a monarchy in 1776, but also against the world's largest transnational corporation, the East India Company. Just before the American Revolution, virtually all the members of the British Parliament were stockholders in the East India Company. A tenth had made their fortunes in that company, and the company generously funded parliamentary elections. Sound familiar? With Parliament completely captured, the East India Company was then able to get what was then the biggest corporate tax cut in the history of the world. It's called the Tea Act of 1773, that allowed them to undercut independent tea distributors here in the colonies. The colonists were furious about this, the Walmartization of the tea business, and they responded by dressing up like Indians, boarding East India Company ships, and throwing $1 million worth of the East India Company's tea into Boston's harbor, triggering the American Revolutionary War. That might explain why our founding fathers, after independence, specifically chose not to give corporations any rights in our Constitution, or even mention the word corporation at all in the entire document. But corporate power in America is relentless. Within 100 years of American independence, morally bankrupt corporate slave masters in the South and rich banksters and industrialists in the North tore our nation apart into a civil war. Abraham Lincoln was forced into an unholy alliance with those corporations in the North, giving them enormous subsidies to build railroads across the nation to help the war effort. And once the war was over, the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, and the other railroad elites rose up with their fortunes, corrupted our government, and ushered in the robber baron era. Alarmed by this and the capture of the Republican Party by these robber barons, in his 1888 State of the Union address, President Grover Cleveland, the only Democrat to serve as president during the Gilded Age, from the death of Abraham Lincoln until Woodrow Wilson, basically, described the grim situation in America, saying, "As we view the achievements of aggregated capital, we discover the existence of trusts, combinations, and monopolies, while the citizen is struggling far in the rear or is trampled to death beneath an iron heel. Corporations, which should be the carefully restrained creatures of the law and the servants of the people, are fast becoming the people's masters." This is from his State of the Union address. But by the turn of the 20th century, working people were fighting back. Labor movements and grassroots populism forced the President, Teddy Roosevelt, Republican Roosevelt, to say in 1912, "To befoul the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics is the first task of the statesmanship of the day." Roosevelt finally constructed a wall separating corporation and state. It was known as the Tillman Act, passed in 1907. It was the very first law ever limiting corporate money in our elections at the federal level. As the law states, "It shall be unlawful for any national bank or any corporation organized by authority of any laws of Congress to make a money contribution in connection with any election to any political office." Those corporations that broke this law were subject to big fines, and executives faced hard prison time. Corporate corrupted government had lit the fuse to war twice and ruled during an era of unprecedented abuse of working people in the United States. With the Tillman Act, Roosevelt hoped a complete separation between the two would defend against the same mistakes of the past. Unfortunately, he was wrong. A decade later, just a decade later, Republican Warren Harding won the presidency on a platform that literally promised quote, "Less government in business, more business in government," end quote. That was his campaign slogan. More scandals followed, corrupting our government. Business was corrupted too. Having gotten what they wanted in fewer regulations and lower taxes, corporations went on a speculative frenzy. The 1920s roared, creating massive real estate and stock market bubbles that eventually burst in 1929, triggering the Republican Great Depression and adding to the rap sheet of the consequences of the unholy alliance between corporation and state. Here was President Franklin Roosevelt describing the horrors of corporate government in 1936.
We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob.
Now, fast forward to 2010. With its Citizens United decision, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that wall separating corporations and state, that wall known as the Tillman Act. For the first time in over a century, corporations could spend unlimited money influencing our elections and our government. The robber barons, this time under names like Koch and Adelson, returned with their corporate war chests overflowing with political blood money. Americans today are well aware of corporate money's corrosive impact on our government. There's the lobbying, the revolving door, the crony capitalism, the super PACs, the dark money groups, the undeniable slant of all legislation favoring the billionaire class over the working class. But fewer Americans are aware of the similar corrupting influence back on business itself. If there's one thing the corporate elite who gave hundreds of millions of dollars to Karl Rove to buy the election should have learned from last Tuesday, it's that they would be better off just focusing on their own damn business. Coal Baron Robert Murray recently announced he's laying off 163 people because he says President Obama was reelected. He claims that due to an Obama second term, his country must go into survival mode. Yet his company, Murray Energy, wasn't in trouble just weeks before the election when Robert Murray shelled out $100,000 in campaign contributions to Karl Rove's super PAC, or when he spent another $3 million on lobbying and other political contributions just over the past year. After all those failed tries to buy seats for Republican politicians, Robert Murray claims his company just can't afford to keep workers on the payroll anymore. But what if he had all those political contributions back? He could easily keep those people employed. And there's Applebee's franchisee Zane Tankel, who gave thousands to Republican politicians this election cycle and is now promising to lay off workers because he doesn't want to comply with the Obamacare mandate of providing health insurance to his employees. This election alone, with the wall of the Tillman Act in rubble, outside groups financed mostly by corporate money spent over $1 billion trying to defeat President Obama and progressives. On top of that, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce opened up its coffers this year and spent an additional $95 million lobbying our government. In 2009 and 2010, the Chamber spent roughly $150 million each year. This flood of corporate money into our politics, whether through lobbying or electioneering, happens every single year in America, corrupting our democratic institutions, but also corrupting our private sector economy. How many more millions of Americans would be working today if, rather than investing $1 billion in Mitt Romney, the corporate elite had invested $1 billion in research and development, or in new factories, or in hiring new workers? Rather than spending $100 million lobbying this year, what if the corporate elite had used that money to give their workers health insurance, or pensions, or better wages? Sure, by unwinding their tentacles around Washington, D.C., the corporate elite might lose some small fraction of their own individual fortunes. They might have to pay a little more in taxes and subsidies for shipping jobs overseas. Those subsidies might just disappear. But in the long run, with a healthier, more productive, and more satisfied workforce, their businesses would grow and flourish, and so too would their own wealth. It's time to rebuild that wall separating corporation